The journey back to Seattle from a long, exhausting assignment in Bozeman, Montana, was supposed to be a straightforward transit across the northern interstate. It was late November, the time of year when the Pacific Northwest sheds its autumn colors and surrenders to a relentless, heavy gray. The drive was an exercise in pure endurance, navigating a rental sedan through winding mountain passes while precipitation fell in thick, unrelenting sheets across the windshield. Fatigue had begun to cloud my vision by the time I crossed the border into the Idaho Panhandle, the dense, towering walls of pine trees closing in on both sides of the slick asphalt. The elements grew increasingly hostile, with a thick, physical fog descending from the Bitterroot Mountains, severely limiting visibility to mere feet ahead of the hood. Recognizing the danger of continuing, I decided to pull off at the next available exit, guiding the vehicle into a small, historically isolated silver mining town nestled deep within a narrow valley. The town of Wallace appeared almost swallowed by the surrounding wilderness, its old brick facades looming like quiet sentinels in the oppressive mist. I navigated toward a rustic, aged motel situated on the absolute edge of the town limits, a place where the cracked pavement of the parking lot surrendered immediately to a steep, aggressively overgrown incline of the ancient forest. Securing a room for the night involved a brief, entirely nonverbal exchange with a weary clerk who slid a heavy brass key across a worn wooden counter. After depositing my luggage in a room that smelled faintly of old timber and damp earth, a profound, restless energy took hold of me. Sleep evaded my exhausted mind, prompting me to return to the vehicle. I drove aimlessly along the outskirts of the town, eventually turning the tires onto a steep, unpaved logging route that carved its way upward into the suffocating darkness of the mountain, leaving the faint sodium lights of the town far below. The atmosphere inside the cabin felt stifling, so I lowered the windows, allowing the freezing, pine-scented mountain air to flood the interior. Seeking some form of distraction from the oppressive isolation, I interacted with the vehicle's radio, twisting the dial through vast stretches of empty static. Eventually, the tuner locked onto a strange, deeply obscure frequency. There were no voices, only a continuous, rhythmic, low-frequency resonance accompanied by the slow, mournful dragging of a stringed instrument. It was a heavy, archaic composition that seemed to vibrate directly through the floorboards and into my bones. I allowed this strange, hypnotic broadcast to fill the cold air as I navigated the winding dirt path, driving at a crawling pace through the suffocating fog. In retrospect, projecting that ancient, rhythmic frequency out into the absolute darkness of the untouched wilderness was a profound mistake. It felt as though I was sending a beacon into an abyss, and something ancient, something buried deep within the timberline, took notice. Returning to the motel shortly after midnight, I maneuvered the vehicle into the very last space of the rear parking lot. It was the most isolated section of the property, positioned directly against the towering embankment where the dense forest loomed over the asphalt. The minimal lighting in this area cast long, distorted shadows that stretched and warped against the side of the building. I opened the driver's side door, stepping out into the freezing night air, and leaned back inside to gather a discarded food wrapper and my travel mug. It was in that precise moment of distraction that the atmosphere around me fundamentally changed. The air pressure plummeted instantly, creating a physical vacuum that pulled the breath from my lungs. A heavy, violent vibration tore through the space, a physical force that rattled the metal frame of the car and vibrated the teeth within my jaw. It was a disturbance of immense, unnatural power, lacking any discernible origin, but carrying a weight that forced me to drop my belongings onto the wet pavement. I looked up toward the top of the steep, overgrown embankment, and my vision locked onto a nightmare. Standing perfectly still among the lower branches of the massive pines was a towering, impossible entity. It possessed a height of at least 8 feet, draped in matted, decaying furs that hung loosely from an emaciated, skeletal frame. Its proportions were deeply wrong, featuring limbs that stretched far beyond any natural biological limit. But it was the head that truly paralyzed my nervous system. Atop a long, pale neck rested the massive, weathered skull of an elk, its bone surface stained with age and tangled with dark moss. Enormous, jagged antlers scraped against the surrounding branches. Deep within the empty eye sockets of the skull, a pale, sickly luminescence fixated entirely upon my position. The entity did not rush forward. It simply observed me, swaying with a subtle, fluid motion that defied its rigid, skeletal appearance. Its elongated, multi-jointed fingers twitched rhythmically against its thighs. The sheer malice radiating from the creature was a physical weight, an ancient, predatory intent that demanded total submission. Instinct, raw and unfiltered, finally overrode the absolute paralysis gripping my muscles. I abandoned the open vehicle, turning my body and sprinting across the wet, crumbling asphalt with a desperation I had never known. Every muscle burned with the effort of fleeing, my eyes locked on the faint, numbered plate of my motel room door. Reaching the threshold, I fumbled violently with the heavy brass key, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The metal finally caught the mechanism, and I threw my weight against the wood, forcing myself inside. I pushed the door back into its frame, securing the deadbolt and the chain lock with frantic urgency. Not satisfied, I threw my entire body weight against the heavy oak dresser, dragging it across the carpet to create a barricade against the entrance. I stripped the heavy blankets from the mattress, dragged them into the small, windowless bathroom, and secured that door as well. I collapsed into the dry porcelain of the bathtub, pulling the thick fabrics over my head, shivering uncontrollably. The hours that followed were a masterclass in psychological torture. I remained completely still, hyper-aware of every subtle shift in the air pressure outside the building, anticipating the catastrophic breach of my sanctuary. I utilized the dim screen of my mobile device to search the obscure history of the region, uncovering chilling regional lore regarding forest mimics and ancient starved spirits that lured their victims through strange frequencies and manipulation of the natural environment. The realization washed over me that my careless broadcast on the logging road had drawn the attention of an apex predator of the spiritual realm, a being that viewed the modern world as nothing more than a hunting ground. Dawn arrived with agonizing slowness, the pitch-black sky gradually surrendering to a bruised, misty gray. I waited an additional hour before dismantling the barricade and peering through a small gap in the heavy curtains. The parking lot was empty. The embankment held nothing but wet pine needles and fog. I gathered my belongings, moving with extreme caution as I approached my vehicle. The driver's side door remained exactly as I had left it, standing wide open to the elements. The interior was untouched. However, as I circled to the front of the sedan, my blood ran entirely cold. Carved deeply into the metal of the hood were 3 massive parallel gouges, stripping the paint away to reveal the raw steel beneath. It was a deliberate, undeniable signature left by the entity, a physical confirmation that the events of the night were entirely, horrifyingly, real. I ignited the engine and departed the property immediately, refusing to check the rearview mirrors until I had reached a small, independent fueling station near the highway entrance. While dispensing fuel into the vehicle, an elderly local attendant emerged from the small convenience store. He moved slowly toward the front of my car, his eyes tracing the deep, aggressive lacerations marring the hood of the vehicle. He then lifted his gaze, meeting my exhausted, terrified eyes. I offered no explanation and he requested none. He studied the paleness of my skin, the trembling in my hands, and the direction from which I had just driven. His weathered face softened into an expression of grim, heavy sorrow. He simply offered a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture carrying the weight of generational knowledge, an unspoken confirmation that he knew exactly what resided in those ancient, fog-choked mountains, and that I was exceptionally fortunate to be leaving them behind. I returned the nod, engaged the transmission, and drove away, carrying the permanent realization that there are vast, untamed corners of the world where humanity is entirely, hopelessly outmatched. The historical archives located in the university city of Freiburg contained extensive, decaying manuscripts detailing the forgotten folklore of the region. My work as a historical researcher required meticulous, exhaustive visual examination of these fragile texts, a process that left my vision blurred and my posture rigid by the end of each day. It was late December, and the academic term had concluded, leaving the vast Gothic architecture of the university largely empty. Seeking absolute isolation to finalize my manuscript, I had secured a short-term lease on a primitive, timber-framed cabin situated deep within the Schwarzwald, the Black Forest. The Romans had named this impenetrable expanse of ancient conifers the Silva Nigra, due to the absolute density of the canopy, which effectively eradicated sunlight even during the peak of the afternoon. Navigating this environment required traversing the Schwarzwald Hochstrasse, a winding, elevated route that offered breathtaking, sprawling vistas during the summer months. However, in the depths of winter, it transformed into a treacherous, visually deceptive ribbon of asphalt, entirely consumed by heavy, swirling mist and aggressive precipitation. The journey from the city back to the isolated cabin began long after the sun had surrendered to the horizon. The atmospheric conditions were severely degraded. Thick, heavy flakes of snow accumulated rapidly against the windshield, forcing the mechanical wipers to sweep back and forth in a frantic, hypnotic rhythm. The illumination from the vehicle's headlamps struggled to pierce the dense, suffocating fog, reflecting backward and creating a brilliant, disorienting white wall just meters beyond the hood. The physical temperature inside the cabin was set to maximum heat, yet a persistent, biting frost managed to creep along the interior edges of the glass, a constant reminder of the hostile environment just beyond the thin metal doors. After miles of agonizingly slow navigation, I reached the specific, unmarked junction that led toward my rented property. I guided the vehicle off the main highway, transitioning onto a narrow, unpaved logging route. Here, the ancient pine trees pressed intimately against the edges of the path, their massive, snow-laden branches forming a suffocating, claustrophobic tunnel. The absolute absence of any external illumination, save for my own failing high beams, created an overwhelming sensation of isolation. It felt as though I was descending into a subterranean environment, leaving the surface world entirely behind. The visual input was monotonous and hypnotic. The sweeping snow, the gray asphalt, the endless vertical lines of the tree trunks. Then, my foot instinctively crushed the brake pedal. The sudden, violent deceleration forced my upper body forward, the heavy nylon of the seatbelt locking aggressively across my chest and collarbone, with enough force to restrict my breathing. The vehicle skidded slightly on the icy surface before coming to a complete, shuddering halt. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel with terrifying intensity, the knuckles turning completely white under the pale glow of the dashboard instrumentation. My gaze was fixed entirely on the space directly ahead. Occupying the exact center of the narrow logging road, perfectly illuminated by the twin beams of the headlights, was a massive, living obstacle. My initial, frantic rationalization attempted to categorize the shape as something native to the region. The Black Forest contains significant populations of red deer and wild boar. However, as the swirling snow momentarily parted, the true, horrifying proportions of the entity became undeniably clear. The physical scale of the creature defied all logical, biological parameters. It possessed a lupine, wolf-like architecture, but the sheer mass of the entity was staggering. Its muscular, broad shoulders reached a height that paralleled the hood of my sport utility vehicle. If the creature had adopted a bipedal stance, its skull would have easily towered over my own. The entity stood, positioned laterally across the path, its body suspended exactly halfway between the dense tree line on the left and the descending ravine on the right. The texture of its exterior was deeply disturbing. It was not the sleek, healthy coat of an apex predator acclimated to the winter environment. Instead, the entity was draped in patches of coarse, matted material that resembled decaying shadows more than actual fur. Large, unnatural sections of its skin appeared entirely devoid of hair, revealing a pale, sickly grayish epidermis beneath. Despite the blinding, aggressive illumination of my high beams casting harsh shadows across its form, the creature remained entirely, horrifyingly motionless. It did not display the erratic, nervous energy typical of a wild animal caught in artificial light. It exhibited no instinctual urge to flee, no physical preparation for a predatory strike. It simply stood there, a monument of unnatural biology, defying the heavy snow accumulating upon its broad back. Its massive head was turned directly toward the windshield. The physical manifestation of primal, unfiltered terror flooded my nervous system. A cold, heavy sweat instantly saturated the fabric of my collar. The blood retreated from my extremities, leaving my fingers numb and unresponsive. My respiratory rate increased dramatically, yet my lungs failed to extract any oxygen from the stifling, heated air inside the vehicle. It was the eyes. When a standard light source strikes the retina of a nocturnal animal, a specialized biological layer known as the tapetum lucidum produces a distinct, glowing reflection, typically possessing a yellow or greenish hue. The eyes of this entity offered no such reflection. They were deep, absorbing voids, possessing a dull, flat coloration that seemed to consume the illumination rather than reflect it. More terrifying than the lack of a visual glow was the absolute, undeniable presence of complex, calculating intelligence behind that gaze. The entity was not analyzing the vehicle as a mechanical threat. The visual focus was locked entirely, purposefully, and exclusively upon my face through the glass of the windshield. It was studying my reaction. As I remained paralyzed, gripped by a profound, suffocating dread, the entity initiated a subtle, deeply unnatural physical movement. The lower mandible of the creature shifted laterally. The movement was entirely mechanical, a disjointed, segmented adjustment of bone and muscle that lacked the fluid grace of a living organism. Slowly, the heavy, dark flesh of its upper lips peeled backward, rolling upward to expose the gums and the dental structure beneath. The teeth were elongated, serrated instruments, possessing a sickly, yellowed enamel that gleamed under the headlights. The physical expression was an imitation, a horrifying, incorrect simulation of a predatory display. Every single instinct, forged by millions of years of human evolution, screamed a singular, undeniable truth into my consciousness. The entity standing in the snow was not an animal. It was an ancient, corrupted mechanism of the forest, wearing a biological disguise that did not fit properly. Panic completely eradicated any remaining logical thought. My right hand moved with frantic, violent energy, gripping the transmission lever and forcing it roughly into the reverse position. My foot abandoned the brake and crushed the accelerator. The vehicle lunged backward, the tires fighting desperately for traction against the accumulated ice and snow. The sudden momentum threw my body aggressively against the seat. I maintained my visual focus entirely on the space ahead, refusing to turn my head to check the rearview mirrors, terrified that breaking visual contact would initiate a pursuit. The world moved backward in a chaotic blur of falling snow and looming pine trunks. Through the receding illumination of the headlights, I observed the entity. It did not alter its lateral stance. It did not initiate a charge. It simply stood its ground in the center of the path. However, as the distance between us increased, its massive, misshapen head swiveled with absolute mechanical precision, tracking my retreat with that same cold, calculating, and entirely human intelligence. I navigated the vehicle backward for what felt like miles, risking a catastrophic slide into the ravine, until the rear tires finally met the familiar, cleared asphalt of the main highway. I executed a violent, desperate turn, pointing the hood toward the distant civilization of the valley, and drove with reckless, dangerous speed. I bypassed my designated exit entirely, pushing the vehicle until I reached the blinding, fluorescent canopy of a 24-hour petrol station situated on the outskirts of a larger municipal center. I parked the vehicle directly under the intense artificial lighting, locking the doors and shrinking into the center console. My hands trembled with such severity that I struggled to manipulate the touchscreen of my mobile device. The bright, sterile environment offered a stark, necessary contrast to the oppressive darkness of the ancient trees. I spent the remainder of the night part in that illuminated square of concrete, utilizing the cellular data network to research the deepest, most obscure fragments of Germanic mythology. I scoured digitized archives and translated forgotten texts, searching for visual descriptions of entities that matched my encounter. The search results yielded chilling references to ancient, corrupted spirits of the Schwarzwald, shapeless horrors that adopted the fragmented appearances of wolves and stags, mimicking the physical forms of nature to observe and occasionally collect those who wandered too deeply into their isolated domains. The rising sun eventually painted the heavily clouded sky in shades of dull gray, providing enough visual clarity to resume driving. I returned to the cabin during the peak of the daylight, packed my belongings with frantic speed, and terminated the lease immediately. I have never returned to the Black Forest region, and I no longer examine the ancient folklore of isolated, densely wooded areas. The knowledge of what stands completely motionless in the deep timber, wearing the incorrect shapes of animals and watching with intelligent, unreflecting eyes, is a reality my mind refuses to process a second time. The academic commitments required by the university located in the historic maritime city of Bristol frequently demanded my presence well into the late evening hours. A series of unfortunate financial miscalculations had previously resulted in the total forfeiture of my personal automobile, an event that forced a sudden, highly inconvenient relocation of my living arrangements. I secured a modest, terribly insulated apartment situated on the extreme eastern periphery of the city, in a district known as St. Anne's. This specific location was chosen purely for its minimal economic burden rather than its geographic accessibility. The distance between the sprawling, Gothic architecture of the campus and my new residence spanned several miles, a journey that intersected directly through the heavily congested, intensely illuminated urban center. To mitigate the chaotic transit experience, I acquired a heavy-duty electric bicycle. This mechanical contrivance quickly became my primary method of navigation. My apartment building possessed a distinct geographical advantage. It was positioned immediately adjacent to the winding, muddy banks of the river Avon. This proximity provided direct, unimpeded access to a secluded, unpaved pedestrian corridor that traced the edge of the water, a route that completely bypassed the illuminated, structured environment of the city's streets. This riverine route presented a direct, linear trajectory from the academic institutions to my residential quarters. However, this specific environmental shortcut harbored a significant, deeply unsettling flaw. A prolonged segment of the trail, measuring perhaps half a kilometer in length and situated immediately preceding the access point to my apartment complex, existed in absolute, total darkness. The municipal authorities had installed zero illumination infrastructure along this stretch. My electric bicycle possessed a front-mounted luminescent diode, but its output was pathetically inadequate, projecting a weak, diffused beam that barely penetrated the heavy maritime fog that routinely rolled off the surface of the river. I opted to disable this insufficient light entirely, forcing my visual cortex to adapt to the extreme low-light conditions. I relied solely on the faint, ambient lunar reflection bouncing off the undulating surface of the water to discern the contours of the muddy path ahead. During my 12-month tenure residing by the river, the number of other humans I visually detected on that specific segment of the trail after the descent of the sun could be counted on a single hand. The environment was entirely abandoned, surrendered completely to the nocturnal elements. Occasionally, my commute would intersect with individuals whose presence in that absolute darkness triggered an immediate, visceral, physical revulsion. I vividly recall the visual encounter with a disheveled figure wandering erratically near the water's edge, their posture communicating profound biological instability. On another occasion, I passed a man whose posture was rigidly upright, his eyes tracking my movement with an intensity that communicated raw, unfiltered hostility, his facial expression entirely visible even in the oppressive gloom. He clearly despised the visual presence of a mechanical vehicle sharing his isolated domain. Yet, among these brief, disturbing visual intersections, only one specific event remains permanently etched into my psychological framework. It is an occurrence I have systematically hidden from my familial and social circles, fearing their analytical judgment and inevitable disbelief. The evening in question progressed identically to countless previous commutes. I successfully navigated the dark, winding corridor of the river path, eventually arriving at the heavy, wrought iron security gate that separated the wild overgrowth of the trail from the structured, paved perimeter of my residential complex. My repeated navigation through the darkness had bred a deep, albeit entirely false, sense of environmental confidence. I possessed no inherent phobias of the unlit world. However, as my bare fingers gripped the cold, damp metal of the gate latch, a profound, paralyzing physical sensation overwhelmed my central nervous system. It was the distinct, undeniable, tactile manifestation of being intensely observed. The temperature of my skin plummeted, and a cold sweat instantly formulated across the back of my neck. I rotated my head, directing my vision back down the narrow path I had just traversed. Approximately 20 meters away, situated directly beneath the failing, intermittent glow of a single orange halogen street lamp that marked the official termination of the municipal boundary, a massive entity occupied the absolute center of the trail. Its physical architecture vaguely resembled a large hunting hound, characterized by a wire-haired, heavily muscled frame and an elongated snout. Yet, its visual presentation was profoundly, horrifyingly incorrect. The entity exhibited the absolute, frozen rigidity of a taxidermy specimen. I scrutinized its deep, broad rib cage, searching for the rhythmic expansion and contraction of biological respiration. There was none. I observed the eyelids, expecting the standard involuntary visual lubrication of a living organism. It did not blink. It simply existed within that space, an immovable, towering monument of dark, matted matter. The most terrifying element of this entity was its ocular structure. Even across the distance, the harsh, flickering illumination from the dying halogen bulb revealed eyes that were biologically incompatible with any known canine anatomy. The irises were small, highly concentrated, and undeniably human in their structural composition. A morbid, suffocating dread cascaded through my veins, rendering my muscular system entirely unresponsive. I dared not decrease the physical distance between us, and the entity mirrored this absolute lack of forward momentum. We became locked within a mutual, hypnotic, visual trance. Throughout the entire duration of this observation, the entity maintained a posture of impossible, statuesque stillness. My perception of time completely dissolved. I could not calculate the duration the entity had occupied that space before my detection, but I refused to sever visual contact. A deep, instinctual understanding formulated within my consciousness. My unwavering gaze was the sole physical force anchoring the entity to that specific location. Deep within the dense, tangled foliage adjacent to the entity's position, a sudden visual disturbance occurred. The tall, damp ferns parted erratically, indicating the rapid, horizontal movement of a smaller biological organism, likely a badger or a fox retreating toward the steep river embankment. The reaction of the stationary entity was instantaneous and biologically impossible. The massive, heavily furred head rotated toward the visual disturbance with the fluid, mechanical velocity of an avian predator, the cervical spine twisting to an angle that would instantly sever the spinal cord of a natural wolf. Electric, painful pulses surged through my extremities. Every nerve ending demanded immediate, explosive physical exertion toward the safety of my apartment. Yet, the paralysis of absolute terror kept my eyes anchored to the creature. Observing its exact location provided a twisted, necessary comfort. Following its visual identification of the smaller animal, the entity executed a maneuver that shattered all remaining logic. The front limbs elevated simultaneously, the spine straightening with sickening fluidity until the creature stood entirely erect upon its elongated hind legs. Its proportions stretched into a towering, impossibly narrow silhouette against the orange light. Then, with the blinding, incomprehensible speed of a falling shadow, it vaulted forward, completely disappearing into the dense black wall of the forest canopy. It required several long, agonizing seconds for my brain to process the visual data my eyes had just collected. The realization that the entity had been entirely fixated on the smaller organism, momentarily distracted from my presence, finally broke the physical paralysis gripping my limbs. I violently pulled the heavy iron gate open. I hoisted the electric bicycle onto my shoulder, my boots slipping and sliding against the wet, degrading mulch of the embankment as I scrambled upward toward the paved surface of the parking lot. Once the rubber tires met the concrete, I engaged the electric motor to its maximum capacity, propelling myself along the perimeter of the building toward my specific unit. My physical actions became entirely automated, governed solely by the primal objective of reaching the structured security of my interior walls. My memory fractures at this point. The next coherent visual data I processed was the ceiling of my bedroom. My body collapsed heavily upon the mattress. A profound, overwhelming urge to weep consumed me. My analytical mind completely failed to categorize the visual sequence of events that had just transpired. I simply possessed a desperate, hollow gratitude that the visual intersection had concluded. For the remainder of my tenancy at the Riverside complex, I permanently abandoned the dark, unpaved trail. I willingly accepted the visual chaos and physical congestion of the illuminated urban transit routes. Navigating through the erratic, unpredictable behavior of the city's nocturnal inhabitants was an infinitely preferable alternative to ever again witnessing that towering, rigidly impossible entity. That specific visual encounter remains an isolated event in my life. Following my graduation and the subsequent acquisition of a traditional motor vehicle, the crippling anxiety associated with my daily commute gradually subsided. However, I continue to reside within an urban environment, and I have permanently lost the environmental confidence that previously allowed me to navigate unlit spaces without hesitation. The absolute darkness now represents a canvas for horrifying possibilities. My visual perception of the world has been permanently altered. There are entities occupying the obscure corners of our reality that fundamentally contradict our biological comprehension. And attempting to rationalize or bravely observe these anomalies is an exercise in profound, potentially fatal foolishness. The ancient glacial landscapes of the Scottish Highlands possess a stark, unforgiving beauty, particularly within the boundaries of the Cairngorms National Park. My elderly aunt maintained a permanent residence in this isolated region, occupying a heavy, stone-built crofter's cottage that sat upon a sprawling expanse of moorland. The rear perimeter of her property dissolved seamlessly into a dense, untamed stretch of Caledonian pine forest, a wilderness that remained largely untouched by modern agricultural development. The local ecosystem supported a massive population of wild red deer. These magnificent biological specimens frequently emerged from the deep timber to forage across the open heather. My aunt, demonstrating a deep, persistent affection for the local fauna, had established a routine of providing supplemental sustenance for these creatures, particularly during the brutal, freezing depths of the Highland winter. She utilized large wooden troughs positioned at the very edge of the property line, filling them daily with a specific mixture of grains and root vegetables. This sustained provision of resources had cultivated a unique, observable relationship with the local herd. The red deer, normally hypervigilant and prone to immediate flight, had grown accustomed to human visual presence. They would frequently approach the perimeter in large numbers, their behavior relaxed and natural. I had personally witnessed this phenomenon on numerous occasions during my prolonged visits, observing the graceful, quadrupedal movements of the stags and hinds from the safety of the cottage windows. Every biological interaction I had previously witnessed with these animals had been entirely ordinary, characterized by standard, predictable wildlife behavior, until a specific, deeply unsettling late afternoon in late November. The atmospheric conditions were rapidly deteriorating, with a heavy, freezing mist rolling down from the elevated peaks, severely restricting long-distance visibility. I had volunteered to perform the daily distribution of the feed, carrying a heavy canvas sack of grain toward the wooden troughs. The temperature was violently cold, crystallizing the moisture upon the rough fabric of my heavy coat. As I deposited the final measure of grain into the designated receptacle, a solitary physical form materialized from the thick, gray fog obscuring the edge of the ancient pine forest. My initial assumption categorized the approaching figure as an injured member of the local herd. The entity possessed the general biological architecture of a mature red deer stag, yet its physical locomotion was profoundly, terribly incorrect. It did not exhibit the fluid, calculated strides of a natural quadruped. Instead, the creature propelled itself forward with a disjointed, chaotic, staggering motion. Its front limbs seemed to buckle and lock at unpredictable intervals, causing the entire mass of its body to pitch forward aggressively, only to be caught at the absolute last microsecond by a frantic, unnatural overcompensation of the hind legs. The movement resembled a heavy, biological marionette being manipulated by unseen, unskilled forces. I ceased all physical activity, remaining perfectly stationary beside the wooden trough, gripped by a sudden, intense wave of physiological revulsion that I could not immediately justify. As the entity closed the physical distance between us, the specific anatomical anomalies became horrifyingly apparent. The creature possessed a massive cranial structure, but the defining skeletal crown was violently asymmetrical. The right side of the skull bore a heavy, jagged stump where a massive antler had been completely severed, the bones splintered and raw, suggesting a catastrophic physical trauma rather than a natural, seasonal shedding process. However, the sheer wrongness of its skeletal damage was instantly eclipsed by the horrifying reality of its ocular presentation. The entity ceased its chaotic forward momentum, coming to a complete, rigid halt approximately 4 meters from my position. It elevated its massive, disfigured head, locking its gaze directly onto my face. The pupils of a natural ungulate are horizontally elongated, a specific evolutionary adaptation designed to provide a panoramic field of vision for detecting predators. The eyes set within the skull of this specific creature completely lacked this biological trait. The pupils were perfectly mathematically round. They were contracted, precise, and contained a deep, calculating, and undeniably human intelligence. A violent electrical shock of pure, unadulterated terror violently discharged through my central nervous system. The physical environment seemed to warp and distort around the edges of my vision. The entity did not blink. The standard, necessary lubrication of the biological eye was entirely absent. It simply maintained this intense, deeply invasive visual connection, its posture rigid, radiating an aura of ancient, focused malice. The absolute lack of natural animal behavior, the absence of grazing instincts, the failure to scan the environment, the intense, predatory focus shattered my psychological composure. I slowly, deliberately walked backward, refusing to break visual contact, my boots retreating across the freezing mud until my spine met the solid, reassuring stone of the cottage exterior. I reached blindly for the iron handle of the rear entrance, manipulating the latch and forcing my body inside before violently securing the heavy timber door. I immediately retreated to the large panoramic window in the kitchen, positioning my body behind the heavy fabric curtains to observe the exterior environment. The other members of the local herd, which typically arrived in significant numbers upon the distribution of the feed, were entirely absent. The moorland was completely desolate, save for the single, disfigured entity standing beside the wooden trough. The creature had lowered its massive head and was consuming the provided grain. Yet, the physical mechanics of this consumption were entirely wrong. The mastication process was aggressive, mechanical, and rigid. Furthermore, throughout the entire duration of its feeding, the entity never once lowered its gaze to the trough. Its human-like, perfectly round pupils remained locked entirely upon the specific window where I stood concealed, tracking my exact position through the glass with impossible precision. Upon concluding its mechanical consumption, the entity initiated its retreat toward the tree line. Its gait remained highly erratic, yet it executed a physical action that paralyzed my respiratory function. As it staggered away, the creature rotated its long, thick neck backward, maintaining uninterrupted visual contact with the cottage. Upon reaching the exact threshold where the open heather met the dense, vertical trunks of the ancient pine forest, the creature executed a maneuver that fundamentally broke my understanding of reality. The entity ceased its quadrupedal motion entirely. The heavy musculature of its hindquarters engaged with sudden, violent kinetic energy. The creature elevated its entire physical mass, the spine straightening until it achieved a perfectly bipedal, upright stance. It stood there, a towering, impossibly tall silhouette against the freezing mist, balancing upon its hind hooves while its front limbs hung uselessly against its torso. It maintained this horrifying, upright posture, its visual focus remaining pinned to the structure of the cottage before slowly melting backward into the obscuring darkness of the timber. I physically collapsed against the kitchen counter, my hands trembling with enough violence to rattle the ceramic items resting upon the surface. I firmly sealed every set of heavy curtains within the property, transforming the interior into a visually isolated bunker. The descent of the sun brought an oppressive, heavy darkness to the highland environment. Several hours later, a distinct, powerful tactile disturbance registered against the exterior architecture of the cottage. The heavy, reinforced glass of the living room window began to vibrate violently within its wooden frame. The physical impact was rhythmic, deliberate, and possessing significant kinetic force. I crept toward the edge of the drawn curtains, my heart hammering against my ribs with agonizing pressure. I created a microscopic visual aperture between the heavy fabrics and peered into the freezing blackness outside. Positioned directly against the exterior pane of glass was the entity. It was maintaining its impossible bipedal stance, its massive, disfigured frame towering over the window ledge. The creature was utilizing its remaining jagged antler and the hard keratin of one front hoof to apply immense, rhythmic physical pressure directly against the fragile barrier separating us. The visual input was a masterpiece of pure horror. The breath from its nostrils created thick, rhythmic clouds of condensation against the cold glass, briefly obscuring those perfectly round, unblinking human eyes that stared directly into the microscopic gap in the curtains. It possessed absolute, terrifying knowledge of my exact location within the structure. I abandoned the living room entirely, retreating deep into the interior architecture of the stone cottage. I sought refuge within the small, heavily fortified larder, a room originally designed for storing preserves, possessing thick stone walls and, crucially, 0 exterior windows. I secured the heavy wooden door, sitting upon the cold slate floor in absolute, paralyzing darkness, waiting for the structural integrity of the window glass to fail. The physical vibrations eventually ceased. The following morning revealed 0 physical evidence of a breach. However, subsequent visual confirmation from my elderly aunt validated the entire horrifying sequence of events. From the elevated vantage point of her second-story bedroom, she had directly observed the towering bipedal entity emerge from the tree line and aggressively interact with the lower architecture of the cottage. The innocence of the highland wilderness was permanently eradicated. We immediately sourced and installed high-definition, motion-activated visual recording equipment across the entire exterior perimeter of the property. The supplemental feeding routine was permanently terminated. We exist now in a state of constant, paranoid visual vigilance, scanning the tree line for any sign of that towering, disfigured silhouette, burdened by the permanent knowledge that the entity in the forest is merely wearing the skin of the natural world, observing us with eyes that belong entirely to a predator of a different reality. The vast, unyielding expanse of the Siberian taiga presents a geographical isolation that fundamentally alters human perception. My temporary residence was established within a heavily fortified, centuries-old timber research station situated hundreds of kilometers from the nearest structured settlement, deep within the Republic of Saka. This specific territory, heavily dominated by ancient towering larch and dense birch forests, exists in a state of permanent, deep frozen hostility during the extended winter months. The nearest paved transit route was a mere theoretical line on a topographical map, entirely buried beneath several meters of compacted glacial precipitation. Our presence in this specific uncharted sector was dictated by a prolonged geological survey, a professional commitment necessitating a complete physical and psychological surrender to the extreme visual and tactile severity of the Russian wilderness. The celestial conditions on this particular evening in late January provided a harsh, unrelenting illumination. A massive, perfectly spherical moon hung suspended within a star-choked, cloudless atmosphere, casting a brilliant blue-white luminescence across the vast oceanic expanse of the frozen snowpack. The visual clarity was absolute, allowing for uninterrupted observation of the surrounding timberline for considerable distances in every direction. My senior colleague, a seasoned surveyor named Dmitri, had retreated into the thermal security of the heavy timber lodge to physically process the day's collected geological samples, pulling the thick, heavily insulated iron-reinforced door firmly shut against the catastrophic external temperatures. I remained positioned outside on the perimeter, specifically tasked with the mechanical maintenance of the large diesel generator that provided vital power to our sensitive measuring equipment. The physical reality of the Siberian atmosphere at 40 degrees below zero is a violent tactile assault on the fragile human biological system. The atmosphere itself felt physically heavy, viscous, and aggressively hostile, instantly crystallizing the ambient moisture upon the thick fabric of my protective facial gear. The intense physical exertion required to manipulate heavy metallic tools in such brutal conditions commanded my total visual and muscular concentration. The surrounding environment was a portrait of absolute frozen immobility. The towering evergreens stood rigidly against the dark, starlit canvas of the night sky, locked entirely within the paralyzing grip of the deep freeze, presenting a landscape entirely devoid of natural motion. It was precisely at this moment of focused physical labor that a catastrophic environmental anomaly occurred. A massive, invisible wave of kinetic pressure violently impacted my physical form. The physical sensation was remarkably akin to the sudden atmospheric displacement caused by a heavy subterranean detonation. I visually observed a violent, localized disturbance deep within the distant tree line, perhaps 300 meters from my immediate position. Massive, snow-laden branches fractured and whipped backward with explosive, physics-defying force, a visual chaos entirely independent of any meteorological wind patterns. A massive flock of large, dark avian specimens erupted from the upper canopy in a frantic, chaotic visual display of pure biological terror, their black silhouettes scattering frantically against the brilliant lunar backdrop as they desperately sought distance from that specific coordinate. A profound, paralyzing dread instantly saturated my central nervous system. The heavy, forged steel wrench slipped from my thick, insulated gloves, plunging into the compacted snow at my boots. I slowly rotated my cervical spine, dragging my visual focus away from the distant environmental disturbance and back toward the immediate perimeter of the wooden lodge. Positioned entirely motionless upon the crest of a small, sculpted snowdrift, a mere 10 meters from my physical location, was a pristine, visually blinding canine entity. Its physical architecture heavily resembled the indigenous, robust Yakutian Laika, yet the biological proportions were unnaturally exaggerated and deeply unsettling. The creature possessed an impossibly immaculate, pale coat that completely lacked the standard dirt, matting, or physical imperfections of any wild organism surviving in such a brutal, unforgiving ecosystem. It was a visual anomaly of pure, blinding white against the deep blue shadows of the surrounding snowpack, possessing a cleanliness that bordered on the sterile. The most deeply disturbing physiological discrepancy, however, was its interaction with the extreme temperature of the environment. In a climate where every single exhalation of a living, warm-blooded mammal produces a thick, billowing cloud of heavy steam, this specific entity produced absolutely zero visual vapor. Its long jaw was slightly parted, revealing rows of pale, immaculate teeth. Yet the freezing air surrounding its muzzle remained completely undisturbed. It did not shiver. It exhibited zero biological muscular response to the lethal cold pressing against it. Its ocular organs were wide, unblinking pools of pure, reflective black, locked onto my exposed facial features with a terrifying, vacant intensity. It displayed no visual markers of canine curiosity, submission, or predatory aggression. It simply existed as a rigid, physical anchor within the snow. Operating under a misguided, desperate human instinct to initiate a standard biological interaction, I slowly reached into the deep exterior pocket of my heavy parka, retrieving a small, preserved portion of dehydrated meat originally intended for my own consumption. I slowly extended my right arm forward, presenting the visual offering toward the pale entity, consciously maintaining a slow, deliberate, and non-threatening physical posture. The creature offered zero physical acknowledgement of the gesture. The unblinking, dark eyes remained entirely fixed upon my exact position. The sheer lack of any muscular twitch, any subtle visual shift in focus, elevated my internal panic to a critical, overwhelming threshold. I initiated a slow, highly calculated physical retreat, dragging my heavy boots incrementally backward across the slick ice, striving to maximize the spatial distance between us while maintaining unbroken visual contact with the pale anomaly. As I created this desperately needed physical separation, the entity executed a highly specific, deeply unsettling mechanical action. With abrupt, rigid, and deeply geometric precision, the creature snapped its pale head entirely away from my form. It aligned its visual focus directly toward the exact coordinate deep within the timberline where the violent physical disturbance had occurred mere moments prior. It held this unnatural, rigid posture for precisely 3 seconds. Then, it snapped its head rapidly back to my position, locking those dead eyes upon me once again. This identical, mechanical rotation was executed exactly 4 times in rapid, unbroken succession. The movement completely lacked the fluid, natural grace of a biological neck. It heavily resembled the automated, programmed targeting acquisition of a manufactured security lens tracking a designated subject. Upon the exact completion of the 4th rotation, the entity broke visual contact permanently. Without any preliminary shift in bodily weight or preparatory muscular tension indicative of a biological creature, it launched itself across the frozen surface. Its forward velocity was fundamentally incompatible with its physical mass, a blinding white blur streaking directly toward the epicenter of the distant environmental anomaly, disappearing entirely into the dark, vertical columns of the ancient larch trees in a matter of fleeting seconds. The absolute, unfiltered terror of the situation finally shattered my physical paralysis. I abandoned the generator entirely, throwing my body against the heavy timber door of the lodge and frantically securing the complex, multiple locking mechanisms behind me. I immediately bypassed my visibly confused colleague, retrieving a high-powered, long-range optical scope from our specialized survey equipment. I extinguished all internal illumination within the cabin, plunging the room into darkness, and pressed the freezing glass of the optic against the heavy, multi-paned window, desperately scanning the distant tree line where the pale entity had vanished. The intense lunar illumination provided excellent long-range visual clarity. I systematically dragged the magnification focal point across the dense, deep shadows lingering between the ancient trees. Deep within the timber, perfectly aligned with the exact trajectory taken by the pale canine, my optic captured a distinct, moving silhouette. It was not a canine. It was a massive, impossibly tall, shifting mass of dark, dense matter, towering far above the lower branches of the evergreens. The sheer vertical scale of the shape defied any native biological classification known to science. The towering silhouette possessed an erratic, shuddering physical geometry, shifting and contorting its proportions as it moved laterally through the dense forest. A colossal, distorted physical manifestation that the pale canine had seemingly, purposely, drawn my visual attention toward. The visual confirmation of this towering, corrupted entity permanently altered my perception of the natural world. Subsequent intense research into the esoteric, highly localized shamanic history of the indigenous Yakut people revealed chilling, ancient, documented visual accounts. These decaying records described lesser, immaculate pale manifestations utilized specifically as visual extensions. Localized scouts, or sensory anchors, deployed by massive apex spiritual predators native to the deep permafrost. The pristine white canine standing by the generator was never a biological animal. It was merely an organic, disposable lens, a remote visual tool utilized by the colossal, shifting horror lingering deep within the timber to precisely calculate my physical coordinates within its isolated, frozen domain. The rugged, highly elevated geography of the Brecon Beacons in southern Wales presents an environment that is both visually stunning and physically unforgiving. During the peak of the summer months, the rolling expanses of the Black Mountains attract numerous hikers, yet our specific destination was an ancestral, heavily fortified sheep farm located far beyond the designated tourist perimeters. The property, currently managed by my older sibling, existed in a state of profound geographical isolation, nestled deeply within a steep, glacially carved valley. The nearest neighboring structure was positioned several kilometers across the treacherous, bog-filled moorland. This remote agricultural operation specialized in the cultivation of a highly specific, rare breed of black Welsh mountain sheep. Due to the extreme, unpredictable environmental conditions native to the elevated valley, combined with the ever-present threat of predatory wildlife traversing the ridges, my sibling adhered to a rigid, unyielding nocturnal protocol. Every evening, prior to the total loss of solar illumination, the entire flock was systematically guided into a massive, medieval-era stone enclosure. This structure possessed thick, impenetrable walls and a heavy, iron-reinforced timber gate, securing the valuable livestock against the hostile elements of the Welsh night. My romantic partner and I were visiting this isolated property for a fortnight, seeking a complete physiological detachment from the chaotic visual stimuli of our typical urban existence in London. The transition to this stark, desolate environment was jarring, yet oddly purifying. On the 5th night of our residency, the atmospheric conditions experienced a rapid, severe degradation. A massive, heavy bank of freezing mist descended from the upper peaks, spilling over the ridges and completely inundating the valley floor. The physical density of this fog was extraordinary. It manifested as a solid, oppressive wall of white matter that swallowed the surrounding landscape entirely. Around the midnight hour, my partner and I were situated upon the elevated, wraparound wooden terrace attached to the rear architecture of the main farmhouse. The temperature had plummeted, forcing us to wrap our bodies in thick, heavy wool blankets. The singular, weak, incandescent bulb positioned above the rear entrance struggled violently against the mist, carving out a microscopic hemisphere of golden illumination that extended perhaps 3 meters before hitting the impenetrable white barrier. Prior to stepping out onto the terrace, our visual attention had been consumed by a collection of decaying, centuries-old Celtic manuscripts discovered in my siblings' library. These texts contain deeply disturbing, highly detailed visual accounts of shape-shifting entities native to the Welsh moors. Predatory anomalies that utilized precise physical mimicry to lure isolated travelers into the lethal, bottomless bogs. The psychological residue of these ancient warnings hung heavily in our minds as we observed the swirling, claustrophobic fog pressing against the edge of the light. It was within this suffocating, heavily pressurized atmosphere that the physical environment around us fundamentally altered. The immediate space experienced a sudden, extreme drop in barometric pressure, creating a tactile vacuum that caused the hairs on my forearms to stand rigidly upright. The mist beyond the perimeter of the light seemed to thicken, congealing into a heavy, semi-solid state. Then, a distinct, powerful kinetic vibration registered directly through the thick wooden floorboards of the elevated terrace. My physical form tensed instantly, my eyes locking on to the facial expression of my partner, recognizing the identical manifestation of pure, unfiltered dread mirrored in their dilated pupils. We focused our entire sensory capacity on the tactile information transmitting through the timber beneath our boots. The vibration was rhythmic, deliberate, and possessing a highly specific, heavy mass. It was the undeniable physical impact of a large, quadrupedal organism navigating the wet, uneven grass directly at the base of the wooden staircase leading up to our position. More terrifying than the mere presence of the mass was the precise kinetic signature it projected. The impacts were distinctly asymmetrical. A heavy, dominant strike followed immediately by a dragging, scraping pressure. This specific, uneven distribution of physical weight mathematically replicated the exact locomotive pattern of my siblings' most prized agricultural asset, a massive, aggressively territorial breeding ram that had suffered a severe, permanent injury to its front left limb during a previous breeding season. A paralyzing wave of physiological terror saturated my bloodstream. Mere hours prior, I had personally assisted my sibling in the systematic confinement of the flock. I had physically grasped the heavy, frozen iron padlock, driving the mechanism shut and verifying the absolute security of the stone enclosure. The genuine biological ram was currently locked behind a foot of solid oak and medieval masonry. Yet, the asymmetrical, heavy kinetic impacts continued to register through the wooden structure, pacing deliberately along the unseen perimeter exactly where the mist swallowed the illumination. We remained perfectly, rigidly motionless within our woolen blankets, our respiratory systems restricted to shallow, panicked intakes of the freezing air. We directed our visual focus entirely upon the precise coordinate where the wooden staircase descended into the absolute white void. Slowly, with a deliberate, agonizing lack of momentum, a physical silhouette began to materialize from the dense, suffocating fog. The entity positioned itself exactly at the extreme boundary of the light, refusing to fully cross the threshold into clear visual confirmation. It possessed the exact, undeniable geometric outline of the massive, injured ram. The thick, curled horns framed the head, the heavy mass of the fleece bulked the torso, and the posture was distinctly, perfectly skewed to favor the supposedly damaged limb. However, as the entity lingered within the diffused golden halo of the terrace bulb, the horrifying corrupted details of its visual presentation became sickeningly apparent. The texture of its exterior was fundamentally incompatible with organic wool. It did not interact with the ambient light. Rather, it seemed to actively absorb the illumination, presenting as a dense, shifting void of absolute dark matter that merely held the shape of an animal. Furthermore, the physical proportions were subtly, terrifyingly warped. The curled horns were too mathematically symmetrical, lacking the natural ridges and imperfections of biological growth. The neck, supporting the heavy head, was elongated by several impossible inches. The entity then initiated a highly calculated physical performance. It buckled its front limbs, collapsing its heavy mass against the wet grass at the base of the stairs. It began to thrash its dark, elongated neck violently, throwing its horned head from side to side in a visual pantomime of extreme, desperate biological distress. It dragged its body an inch backward, retreating slightly deeper into the obscuring fog, and repeated the frantic, thrashing motion. The physical intent of the entity was undeniably clear. It was executing a complex, highly evolved visual lure. It possessed the absolute knowledge that human biology responds to the visual distress of a familiar creature. It was actively attempting to manipulate our empathy, projecting a physical demand for rescue designed specifically to pull our bodies off the elevated safety of the terrace and into the total concealment of the freezing mist, where it waited. My partner's fingers dug into the heavy fabric of my coat, the physical pressure communicating an absolute, terrifying comprehension of the entity's objective. The creature continued its violent physical performance, its dark, light-absorbing form thrashing at the edge of our vision, desperately seeking to provoke a physical response. We refused to break the perimeter. With excruciating, synchronized slowness, we elevated our bodies from the wooden chairs. We maintained unbroken visual contact with the thrashing silhouette as we executed a backward, highly controlled retreat across the terrace planks. We reached the heavy oak door of the rear entrance, manipulating the brass handle and dragging our bodies into the interior hallway. We engaged the deadbolt, the chain lock, and the heavy sliding mechanism, physically sealing the architecture against the exterior environment. The remaining hours of darkness were spent in a state of absolute hyper-vigilant observation, our bodies positioned behind the thick, fortified glass of the living room windows, staring into the impenetrable white fog. The tactile vibrations against the exterior structure never materialized, yet the psychological weight of the entity's presence remained a suffocating pressure until the sun finally breached the horizon, aggressively burning away the heavy mist. Our subsequent visual inspection of the property under the harsh clarity of the morning light provided the final, permanent confirmation of the horror. We navigated the wet grass toward the stone enclosure. The heavy iron padlock remained perfectly, flawlessly engaged. Upon opening the timber gate, the entire flock, including the massive asymmetrical ram, was visually accounted for, completely undisturbed within the interior. We then directed our path toward the base of the wooden terrace staircase. The thick white frost that had accumulated upon the lawn overnight documented a horrifying physical truth. There were no cloven indentations in the frozen soil. The physical displacements left behind by the entity that had perfectly mimicked the heavy, quadrupedal motion of the ram were massive, elongated, and deeply pressed into the earth, presenting the undeniable, terrifying geometry of disproportionate, elongated human feet. The entity that had performed the desperate thrashing lure in the fog was a bipedal, predatory anomaly that simply wore the visual outline of our reality. The profound realization that we had been observed, cataloged, and systematically targeted by an ancient mimicking intelligence permanently eradicated our perception of safety within the natural world. We terminated our residency at the farm immediately, fleeing the Black Mountains with the absolute, unshakable knowledge that true, calculating malice exists within the isolated fog, utilizing the familiar shapes of our world to invite us into the dark. The geographic isolation inherent to the deep interior of the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia imposes a profound psychological pressure, particularly during the terminal weeks of autumn. The deciduous forests transform into a vast monochromatic ocean of skeletal timber, reaching upward into the freezing atmosphere like the gray, withered appendages of the deceased. My temporary residence was a heavy ancestral timber cabin, constructed generations prior by my own lineage. This architectural structure sat precariously upon a steep, densely wooded incline, situated more than 40 miles of winding, unpaved switchbacks away from the nearest structured municipal center. My mandatory presence within this extreme isolation stemmed from an unavoidable familial obligation, providing palliative care for my elderly grandfather, who was navigating the final, deteriorating stages of a catastrophic neurological condition. His biological functions were maintained entirely by automated medical apparatuses, his emaciated physical form anchored to a mechanized hospital bed positioned within the furthest room of the interior hallway. The compounding physical and psychological exhaustion had severely compromised my central nervous system. To maintain a necessary state of hypervigilance during the grueling nocturnal hours, monitoring the vital digital metrics displayed on the medical monitors, I engaged in a deeply ill-advised method of mental stimulation. Utilizing a severely degraded satellite data connection, I immersed myself in obscure, digitized archives detailing the dark, localized folklore of the Appalachian High Country. These decaying historical records contained terrifying visual accounts and theoretical analyses of ancient mimicking entities, biological anomalies that governed the pitch-black timberlines. A highly specific, terrifying spiritual absolute was heavily emphasized within these ancient texts. The concentrated cognitive focus of the human mind functions as a brilliant, inescapable beacon within the dark. Continuously researching, visually conceptualizing, and focusing upon these entities actively generates a supernatural gravitational pull, drawing them across the threshold of reality and directly into the physical space of the observer. The absolute arrogance of modern, structured logic entirely blinded my judgment. I categorize these documented warnings as the paranoid, malnutrition-induced hallucinations of early frontier trappers. On the specific night of the catastrophic event, the external atmospheric conditions were entirely devoid of meteorological movement. The spatial environment was so perfectly static that it manifested as a heavy, physical compression against the human body. I was positioned before the illuminated screen of my laptop within my designated sleeping quarters, my exhausted eyes continuously tracking across blurred, charcoal sketches of towering, bipedal anomalies possessing unnatural, brilliant, red ocular structures. The digital time display situated in the lower corner of the monitor indicated the hour was approaching 3 in the morning. Complete biological exhaustion finally overwhelmed my neurological defenses, pulling my consciousness down into a heavy, suffocating darkness. My physical form collapsed heavily against the solid oak surface of the desk. The subsequent transition from absolute unconsciousness to a state of total, paralyzed physical alert occurred without a single physical catalyst. There was zero environmental disturbance, zero kinetic displacement of furniture, and zero alteration in the ambient illumination. My eyelids simply retracted mechanically. The digital clock now displayed precisely 3:15. My central nervous system instantly initiated a catastrophic, maximum-level biological alarm. The barometric pressure within the confines of the bedroom had plummeted to a critical degree, manifesting as a heavy, localized vacuum that aggressively restricted the expansion of my lungs. The ambient thermal temperature experienced an unnatural, immediate collapse. I visually registered my own respiratory exhalations crystallizing into thick, opaque clouds of condensation beneath the weak blue illumination of the laptop screen. A heavy, freezing current of air saturated the enclosed space, carrying a putrid, overwhelming biological scent. The distinct, metallic odor of damp soil, rotting vegetation, and severe organic decomposition. I maintained my collapsed posture upon the wooden desk, utilizing only the microscopic adjustment of my ocular muscles to drag my visual focus toward the extreme right periphery of the room. The absolute primal terror radiating through my veins induced complete muscular paralysis. Occupying the suffocating darkness in the exact corner of the room, situated in the narrow space between the heavy oak wardrobe and the edge of my mattress, a massive, towering physical mass had materialized. The architectural scale of this entity vastly exceeded any known biological parameters for a human or native animal. The apex of its form physically brushed against the heavy timber joists supporting the ceiling. The overall geometry of the creature was draped in the decaying, mottled remnants of gray animal hides. These necrotic fabrics hung loosely from its frame, revealing patches of severely emaciated, pale, and entirely bloodless musculature beneath. Its skeletal architecture was a masterpiece of biological corruption. The lower limbs were impossibly elongated, articulated at sickening, mathematically incorrect angles, while the upper appendages hung uselessly past its knees, terminating in long, blackened, and entirely desiccated digits. Yet, the absolute pinnacle of this psychological horror was concentrated within its cranial structure. It did not possess the facial geometry of a human, nor did it match the precise biological classification of any known predator. Resting atop a long, emaciated neck was the massive, decaying skull of a large, predatory mammal, presenting the approximate bone structure of an ancient, deceased timber wolf. The surface of the skull was fractured, heavily stained with the yellowing residue of profound age and draped in thick, dusty cobwebs. Positioned deep within the hollow, bone-dry orbital cavities of this deceased skull were two active, biological ocular organs. They were fundamentally incompatible with the surrounding dead tissue. The structural dimensions of the iris and pupil possess the exact, terrifying mathematical precision of a human eye, yet they burned with an unnatural, deeply saturated crimson luminescence. This specific light did not project outward into the environment. It did not cast red reflections upon the surrounding drywall. The illumination appeared entirely contained within the fluid of the eye itself, radiating an ancient, calculating, and purely sadistic malice. Those glowing crimson voids were locked directly onto the exposed skin of my neck, maintaining a terrifying, unblinking focus. The entity remained in a state of absolute, impossible physical immobility. It executed no aggressive physical lunges, no posturing indicative of a kinetic strike. It simply stood within the intimate boundary of my personal space, engaging in a deeply invasive, prolonged visual analysis. It possessed absolute knowledge of my conscious state. It visually registered the catastrophic, paralyzing fear freezing the blood within my circulatory system. It was actively, deliberately absorbing the raw, unfiltered terror radiating from my biological form. The psychological tension reached a critical fracture point when the entity finally initiated a shift in its physical stance. It did not utilize a standard alternating gait. Instead, the entire colossal mass of the creature executed a smooth, lateral slide forward, a motion that fundamentally violated the standard physics of friction and gravity. It positioned the decaying, predatory skull into the microscopic physical space hovering directly over my right shoulder. The freezing, necrotic atmosphere emanating from its form pressed physically against my epidermis, delivering the absolute, suffocating darkness of the cursed timberline. It was exactly at this invisible boundary of physical interception that the focused attention of the entity abruptly diverted. The crimson illumination retracted from my peripheral vision. The creature executed a slow, mechanical rotation of its elongated cervical spine, twisting the bone structure to an impossible degree, directing its visual focus toward the partially open bedroom door. Looking straight down the dark hallway leading directly toward the medical quarters of my grandfather, its supernatural sensory apparatus had seemingly locked onto a rapidly fading biological energy, a far weaker, entirely defenseless target. Maintaining that same physically impossible gliding locomotion, the massive entity slipped silently out of my bedroom, its towering silhouette dissolving entirely into the heavy darkness of the corridor. The paralyzing grip on my musculature shattered instantly, replaced by a violent, frantic surge of pure survival instinct. I propelled my body out of the wooden chair, sliding my back against the cold drywall of the hallway, my visual focus violently concentrated on tracking the entity's physical trajectory. As my body crossed the threshold into my grandfather's medical room, the visual data presented permanently incinerated my psychological stability. The colossal entity was bent violently at the waist, its massive, dark form completely eclipsing the architecture of the hospital bed. The brilliant, concentrated crimson light from its impossible eyes was projected directly downward, bathing the emaciated, tube-covered facial features of my grandfather in a horrifying, bloody glow. My grandfather was completely, entirely conscious. His clouded, failing eyes were stretched to their absolute maximum biological limit, the pupils dilated to absorb the terrifying crimson reflection. The musculature of his face was violently contracted into an expression of absolute, unimaginable physical panic and pure, unfiltered despair. He engaged in a frantic, microscopic physical struggle, attempting to elevate his frail, skeletal arms into the air to establish a defensive barrier, but total physiological exhaustion had entirely stripped him of all kinetic capability. Heavy, biological tears spilled from the corners of his eyes, trailing down his pale skin to stain the sterile white linens. The entity did not initiate any physical contact with his failing body. It simply hovered there, engaging in the systematic, deliberate extraction of his final remaining warmth, his last fractured remnants of hope, and the microscopic fraction of life force tethering his consciousness to reality. It was consuming his absolute, ultimate terror with slow, deliberate satisfaction. Following a prolonged, immeasurable sequence of time, the entity slowly retracted its physical mass, assuming its towering, upright posture once again. It executed a final, mechanical rotation of the skull, delivering one last, visually paralyzing glance in my direction. It was an undeniable, physical confirmation that the ancient texts were absolutely accurate. My reckless intellectual curiosity had served as the beacon. My focused attention had unlocked the door. The towering silhouette retreated backward, melting seamlessly into the heavy shadows accumulating in the corner of the medical room, its physical mass evaporating entirely from the structure of our reality. Its departure triggered a massive, localized stabilization of the barometric pressure, causing the surrounding medical apparatuses to simultaneously flash rapid, red visual error warnings. I vaulted across the room, my hands gripping the metal railing of the bed. The expression of absolute, paralyzing horror remained permanently frozen into the facial musculature of my grandfather. But the rhythmic, biological pulse displayed upon the digital monitor had flatlined into a perfect, unwavering, horizontal trajectory. The biological process of life had permanently ceased. Before the sun breached the horizon that morning, I systematically completed all necessary medical and legal documentations with complete robotic detachment. I packed my minimal belongings and abandoned the Appalachian Mountains immediately. I permanently eradicated all digital search histories, physically destroyed the laptop hardware, and established an impenetrable psychological barricade, permanently forbidding my consciousness from ever analyzing or conceptualizing ancient folklore again. These entities are not the byproducts of human imagination. They are the spiritual parasites of the absolute dark, forever waiting for a curious, focused mind to illuminate their path, allowing them to locate, observe, and eventually consume. The geographical vastness of the Atchafalaya Basin in southern Louisiana presents an environment that is deeply hostile to human habitation. It is a sprawling, prehistoric network of dense cypress swamps, stagnant waterways, and suffocating humidity that physically weighs upon the respiratory system. My temporary residence was a dilapidated, elevated timber structure, suspended 12 feet above the saturated earth atop massive, moss-draped wooden pilings. This isolated architectural refuge, the environment demanded a rigid adherence to specific survival protocols. The rapid biological decomposition native to pungent odor of decaying organic matter and stagnant water. The celestial bodies were completely obscured by an impenetrable canopy of ancient cypress branches and heavy, hanging curtains of Spanish moss. The visual environment beyond the immediate perimeter of my elevated deck was a solid, impenetrable wall of absolute blackness. A critical mechanical failure forced my physical descent into that blackness. The primary diesel generator, positioned within a heavily fortified wooden shed at the absolute base of the pilings, ceased its kinetic function. The sudden loss of electrical current instantly extinguished the internal illumination of the cabin, plunging the interior into a suffocating dark. Restoring the mechanical function was not a matter of convenience. It was a rigid, biological necessity to maintain the climate-controlled preservation units housing weeks of irreplaceable botanical samples. I secured a heavy, forged steel machete to my belt, a standard, necessary precaution against the native reptilian predators occupying the basin, and retrieved a high-lumen, military-grade handheld optic. I manipulated the heavy deadbolt of the cabin door, stepping out onto the elevated wooden platform. The descent down the steep wooden staircase was an exercise in extreme, hypervigilant observation. I directed the intense, focused beam of the optic downward, slicing a narrow corridor of blinding white illumination through the heavy, suspended moisture of the swamp fog. The wooden steps were slick with accumulated algae and condensation, requiring slow, highly calculated physical shifts of my bodily weight. Upon reaching the saturated, unstable soil of the ground level, The true oppressive nature of the basin fully enveloped my physical form. The vegetation here was aggressively dense, consisting of thick, broad-leafed ferns and massive, intertwined root systems projecting. The beam of the optic revealed nothing but the chaotic, tangled geometry of the swamp flora. I reached the immediate perimeter of the mechanical shed. Positioned directly adjacent to the heavy wooden door was a massive, ancient, bald cypress tree. Its base was a chaotic, sprawling architecture of thick wooden knees and exposed roots, creating a deep, cavernous hollow beneath the trunk that was completely shielded from the ambient moonlight. I directed my physical impossible velocity of a predatory strike, violently clamping around my right ankle. The tactile feedback transmitted through my nervous system completely defied logical biological categorization. The grip possessed the crushing, inescapable mechanical pressure of a heavy industrial vice. The physical material wrapping around my lower limb did not register as the scales of a reptile, nor the fur of a mammal. It felt entirely like cold, hardened, and severely desiccated human leather, stretched tightly over a framework of rigid, unnatural bone. My forward momentum was instantly, violently arrested. The sudden application of opposing kinetic force threw my upper body off balance, sending the heavy optic tumbling from my grasp. The device struck the soft mud, its beam violently rotating to illuminate the chaotic underside of the cypress roots. Within that blinding, erratic slash of light, my dilated pupils registered a visual impossibility. The appendage anchoring my body to the earth was possessing at least twice the number of standard biological joints. They wrapped entirely around my ankle. The long, blackened, and severely sharpened keratin of the nails digging aggressively into the thick leather, actively seeking the vulnerable flesh beneath. The wrist connecting to this monstrous hand extended backward into the absolute, impenetrable blackness beneath the roots. A violent, involuntary surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline flooded my circulatory system. The entity beneath the tree initiated a massive, sustained application of kinetic force, physically dragging my bodily mass backward, pulling my boot toward the dark, narrow aperture of the root cavern. The sheer physical strength of the entity was staggering, easily overcoming the traction of my remaining leg against the wet soil. Logic and scientific observation were instantly incinerated by the primal, unfiltered instinct to survive. I abandoned all attempts to physically pry the elongated digits from my limb. I twisted my upper torso violently, reaching toward my belt. My hand found the heavy, textured grip of the forged steel machete. I drew the blade in a wide, frantic arc, entirely driven by the raw, panicked energy of a cornered animal. I directed my visual focus entirely upon the pale, taut wrist extending from the mud, and brought the heavy steel down with the absolute maximum kinetic force my musculature could generate. The physical impact was a heavy, violent collision of steel against unnatural, rigid bone. The blade connected deeply with the pale appendage. The entity's reaction was an instantaneous, explosive physical recoil. The crushing, vice-like pressure around my ankle vanished entirely. The pale, elongated fingers unspooled with sickening mechanical speed, and the entire appendage retracted violently back into the entirely disregarding the high probability of a catastrophic physical fall. I threw my bodily mass through the threshold of the elevated cabin, driving the heavy deadbolt home and dragging a massive wooden dining table across the floorboards to barricade the entrance. The mechanical generator remained unfixed. The interior of the cabin remained in absolute, suffocating darkness. I spent the remainder of the nocturnal hours positioned in the absolute center of the room, the heavy steel blade grasped tightly in both hands, my visual focus locked intensely upon the reinforced timber of the door. The arrival of the morning sun brought the harsh, uncompromising clarity of daylight to the Atchafalaya Basin. I emerged from the barricaded structure, packing only my most vital personal documents, abandoning the botanical specimens entirely. I descended the staircase for the final time. The heavy optic remained half buried in the mud near the mechanical shed. I completely avoided the massive root system of the cypress tree. Physical truth remains etched into the heavy leather of my right boot. Deep, geometric lacerations caused by elongated, impossible nails. The deep swamp does not merely contain unclassified flora. It conceals ancient, predatory anomalies that dwell within the root systems, possessing the terrifying, corrupted appendages of humanity, waiting patiently in the dark to drag the observant down into the earth. The vast volcanic expanse of Daisetsuzan National Park, situated deep within the central highlands of Hokkaido, exists as a kingdom of permanent, unforgiving frost. Geographical isolation in this region transcends a mere spatial measurement. It manifests as a crushing, physical pressure acting upon the nervous system of any biological organism attempting to endure its territory. My designated residence was a highly degraded meteorological observation station, heavily fortified by massive, ancient fir logs and heavily oxidized steel plating, clinging precariously to a severe alpine incline. The physical distance from this elevated, treacherous vantage point to the nearest artificial civilization was calculated in hundreds of kilometers of dense, snow-choked timber, entirely devoid of any visual indicators of human intervention. My professional mandate, which required the continuous gathering of optical atmospheric data and geological core samples, forced frequent, prolonged exposure to the extreme severity of the natural environment. To ensure a high probability of survival against the native biological threats, specifically the colossal Ussuri brown bear, a predator driven by absolute predatory instinct, I had secured a highly specialized biological companion. This asset was a mature Tosa canine, weighing nearly 100 kilograms, an apex biological fighting mechanism selectively bred for massive muscular density, hyper-thickened skeletal architecture, and a profoundly reinforced cranial structure. The physiological baseline of this specific Tosa breed completely lacked the biological concept of fear. During my 6-month tenure at the observation station, I had visually verified countless instances of this animal confronting extreme natural hazards head-on. On one specific, the Tosa merely launched its heavy form forward, its muscular frame rigid as a projectile cutting through the blizzard, projecting an aura of absolute, physical dominance that forced the towering apex predator to halt its advance and retreat deeply back into the timberline. The ocular focus of the Tosa perpetually burned with hypervigilance, radiating the primal confidence of an organism engineered to occupy the absolute pinnacle of the local food chain. Yet, my entire foundational understanding of that biological courage was permanently incinerated on a late afternoon near the termination of November. The atmospheric composition on that specific day presented a deeply unnatural optical character. The solar body was descending rapidly beneath the horizon line, casting weak, heavily saturated crimson rays through the dense, vertical columns of the fir trees. The barometric pressure experienced a sudden, severe collapse, generating a distinct, heavy compression against my rib cage and drastically slowing the circulation of blood within my extremities. The surrounding environment entered a state of absolute physical suspension. The microscopic ice crystals ceased their descent, appearing to levitate entirely motionless within the freezing atmosphere. The massive, heavy branches of the ancient trees, which perpetually swayed under the force of the alpine currents, suddenly became rigidly locked in place, maintaining an absolute, petrified posture like fossils carved from dark stone. There was a complete absence of any visual markers indicating biological life. The migratory avian populations vanished entirely from the sky, and the tracks of small rodents upon the snowpack were completely erased. I was positioned upon the exterior wooden platform of the station, documenting the final thermal metrics of the day. The massive Tosa stood approximately 3 meters from my position, its intense optical focus directed toward the dark edge of the forest. Suddenly, an extreme, horrifying physiological transformation overtook the body of this fearless biological machine. The entire 100-kilogram mass of dense, fighting muscle began to seize and vibrate with an incredibly violent amplitude. Its spinal column arched downward to the lowest possible geometric angle. The massive, thick tail, previously held in a posture of rigid pride, clamped tightly between its hind limbs. Its pupils dilated to their absolute biological maximum, reflecting a state of primal, unfiltered terror that vastly exceeded any standard defensive limitation. The animal executed zero aggressive posturing, displaying no teeth and offering no physical preparation for a kinetic strike. It simply retreated, lowering its center of gravity until its chest pressed firmly against the freezing wooden planks, and dragged its heavy body frantically toward my boots. It compressed its massive, vibrating form aggressively against my legs, desperately seeking physical shelter, having completely abandoned the core, engineered instincts of a combat organism. The extreme physical reaction of a creature entirely unacquainted with fear instantly triggered a massive surge of adrenaline through my own circulatory system. If a flawless biological mechanism was experiencing such profound neurological collapse, the entity occupying the space beyond the tree line was unequivocally alien to the natural ecosystem. I shifted my optical focus, staring intently into the dark spatial void where the massive fir trunks intertwined. The dying, crimson solar light reflected weakly against the snow, creating a horrifying optical contrast. From within that heavy, congealed darkness, a mass of biological matter slowly separated itself. At a distance of approximately 30 meters, an entity possessing the general anatomical outline of a native deer began to materialize. However, its physical composition was a profound insult to the laws of biological anatomy. Its exterior dermis was not a sleek, insulated coat. It was a deeply necrotic surface, sloughing off in massive, ruined sections, exposing pale, severely ulcerated muscle tissue, completely devoid of active blood circulation. Atop a painfully thin neck, fractured at an impossible, mathematically incorrect angle, rested the skull of a deer bearing a massive, entirely asymmetrical set of antlers. One side completely shattered, leaving a jagged, sharpened base exposed to the freezing air. Yet the visual detail that directly devastated my cognitive processing was the ocular presentation of the entity. They were not the horizontally aligned pupils of a grazing herbivore. Deep within the stained, yellowed orbital cavities sat two perfectly spherical, biologically flawless human eyes. They did not reflect the crimson light of the dusk. They presented as deep, absorbing voids, locking their visual focus directly onto the physical coordinates of myself and the cowering animal at my feet. Zero biological lubrication occurred. It did not blink. It simply maintained a cold, soulless observation, radiating infinite malice. The entity paused within a clearing on the snowpack. It remained physically motionless for several seconds, maintaining that piercing visual lock. Then, It initiated a sequence of mechanical movements that collapsed every physical concept within my mind. The joints in its front limbs folded inward, while the musculature of its hind legs suddenly engaged with immense tension. Its height now vastly exceeded any biological limit, casting a colossal, distorted, and heavily elongated shadow against the twilight sky. Its front limbs hung uselessly along its flanks, the sharpened hooves twitching with erratic, involuntary spasms. It maintained this horrifying bipedal posture, a crude, mocking imitation of human evolutionary development. Its perfect human eyes never severed visual contact with my face. A deeply freezing, necrotic atmospheric current slowly expanded from the tree line, carrying the dark essence of severe decay, pressing against the optical perimeter of the observation station. The absolute physical suspension of the environment, combined with that grotesque anatomical anomaly, completely fractured my psychological will to survive. I bent low, utilizing maximum physical exertion to drag the heavy, seizing mass of the Tosa backward toward the thick, heavily reinforced steel door of the main structure. I refused to break optical contact with the entity for even a microscopic fraction of a second, paralyzed by the absolute certainty that severing my visual focus would result in the entity closing the spatial distance with impossible velocity. Once my body and the animal were fully contained within the structural boundary of the station, I engaged the heavy steel handle, driving numerous deadbolts and thick oak crossbars firmly into their brackets. The interior space plunged into a state of oppressive, heavy darkness. The Tosa immediately forced its massive body into the deepest, darkest spatial void beneath the iron frame of the bed, compressing itself into the smallest possible geometry, its heavy musculature continuing to vibrate in endless rhythmic waves. I approached the reinforced glass window, shifting the heavy black canvas slightly to create a microscopic optical aperture, directing my vision back toward the forest edge. The necrotic, deer-like anomaly remained standing upon the snow, maintaining its unnatural bipedal architecture. It slightly tilted its asymmetrical skull, its cold human eyes scanning back and forth across the physical structure of the station, heavily analyzing the architectural integrity of our refuge. Finally, after a prolonged, immeasurable duration, defying standard temporal metrics, it slowly rotated, the visual reality of humanity's most formidable biological combatant being stripped of all survival instinct by the mere optical presence of an entity standing upright within the deep timber remains a permanent, burning psychological scar. The isolated, untamed regions of this world harbor more than mere biological hazards. They are the domain of anomalies existing far beyond human comprehension. Things that wear the skins of the natural world, observe us with the eyes of humanity, and utilize the absolute physical stillness of the environment as their most devastating weapon. The geographical extremity of the Lyngen Alps in northern Norway presents an environment that is deeply, fundamentally incompatible with human biological survival. During the specific temporal window known as the Mørketid, the polar night, the solar body entirely fails to breach the horizon line for a period exceeding 2 consecutive months. This absolute absence of natural diurnal illumination creates a permanent, heavy atmospheric darkness, transforming the glacial fjords and jagged, ice-choked peaks into a visual representation of absolute, cosmic isolation. My psychological architecture had experienced a complete, catastrophic structural collapse. A prolonged sequence of severe personal tragedies had entirely amputated my biological will to continue navigating the human experience. The logical, analytical portions of my central nervous system had arrived at a cold, calculated conclusion. The cessation of my biological functions was the only remaining viable objective. I possessed zero desire for a violent, dramatic exit. I sought only a slow, fading transition into absolute nothingness. The extreme negative thermal conditions of the Arctic wilderness offered the most efficient, neurologically numbing method to achieve this permanent cessation. I acquired a heavily insulated rental vehicle in the coastal municipality of Tromsø, navigating the machine deep into the interior, intentionally bypassing every structured settlement and illuminated outpost. I drove until the paved asphalt completely surrendered to a primitive, unmaintained logging route, pushing the vehicle until the dense accumulation of glacial snow physically immobilized the front axle. I disengaged the ignition. I abandoned the thermal security of the internal cabin, stepping out into the crushing physical weight of the Arctic atmosphere. The ambient temperature was registering at approximately 35 degrees below zero. The air was a heavy, viscous fluid that instantly crystallized the moisture upon my eyelashes, effectively sealing the edges of my visual field. I initiated a slow, deliberate physical march away from the vehicle, forcing my body deep into the towering, ancient columns of the frozen birch forest. My physical navigation was guided only by the weak, celestial radiation of the aurora borealis, a sickly, undulating ribbon of pale green plasma twisting violently against the absolute blackness of the upper stratosphere. After completing a treacherous, exhausting ascent spanning several kilometers, I reached a small, entirely frozen glacial depression surrounded by steep, monolithic slabs of black granite. This precise geographical coordinate represented the absolute terminus of my physical journey. I positioned my body upon a flat, ice-covered boulder. I initiated the deliberate, methodical removal of my heavy, insulated exterior garments. I discarded the thick thermal parka, the heavy gloves, and the protective facial covering, deliberately exposing my fragile biological form to the lethal, freezing environment. The physiological process of severe hypothermia is highly predictable. The initial stage involves violent, involuntary muscular spasms as the central nervous system desperately attempts to generate internal friction. I endured this physical trauma with absolute, rigid acceptance. Eventually, the biological failsafes surrender. The circulatory system forcefully constricts the blood vessels within the extremities, prioritizing the preservation of the core organs, resulting in a profound, heavy numbness that slowly creeps upward from the hands and feet. My visual perception began to heavily distort. The sharp, geometric outlines of the ancient birch trees softened into blurred charcoal silhouettes. The sickening green light of the aurora borealis smeared across my retinas, presenting an optical hallucination of a world dissolving into absolute, motionless static. I was peacefully, willingly surrendering my consciousness to the freezing dark. It was precisely within this microscopic threshold between life and permanent biological cessation that an extreme visual anomaly intruded upon my fading optical field. Positioned at the absolute periphery of my vision, where the dense birch trunks merged into a solid wall of shadows, a massive physical shape detached itself from the surrounding darkness. My deteriorating cognitive functions initially attempted to categorize the silhouette as a native Svalbard reindeer, a common biological entity within this specific latitude. However, as the entity slowly closed the spatial distance, entering the weak green illumination cast by the aurora, the profound, sickening wrongness of its anatomical structure became undeniably apparent. The physical mass of the creature was staggering, vastly exceeding the known parameters of any regional herbivore. Its exterior dermis was completely devoid of insulated fur. Instead, The entity was draped in a severely necrotic, translucent layer of pale tissue that hung loosely from a heavily exaggerated, malformed skeletal framework. The cranial structure was excessively elongated, bearing a massive asymmetrical crown of heavy bone, an impossible rack of antlers that appeared fractured, jagged, and heavily stained with dark organic residue. The entity ceased its forward momentum, remaining perfectly static at a distance of approximately 20 meters. My physical form was entirely paralyzed, completely locked within the advanced stages of hypothermic immobility. I could only utilize the microscopic muscles controlling my eyelids to maintain visual contact. The entity then executed a sequence of physical movements that permanently shattered my understanding of the natural world. The heavy, malformed joints of its front appendages folded inward. The dense, necrotic musculature of its hindquarters engaged with immense kinetic tension. The creature elevated its massive torso, straightening its spinal column with a disjointed, mechanical fluidity until it achieved a towering, perfectly bipedal stance. The vertical geometry of its form was a horrifying, distorted mockery of human evolution, its physical height reaching deep into the lower branches of the ancient trees. The entity slowly rotated its massive, asymmetrical skull, locking its ocular organs directly onto my exposed, freezing face. The eyes set within that decaying, pale skull were absolutely, flawlessly human. They presented perfect, mathematical circles of pure, unreflecting blackness. They did not possess the vacant, instinctual gaze of a foraging animal. They radiated an ancient, hyper-focused, and infinitely sadistic intelligence. The entity engaged in a slow, deliberate optical analysis of my physical state. It visually registered my discarded thermal garments. It completely understood my presence, my vulnerability, and my initial intent to surrender my biological functions. It was waiting for the precise moment of my physiological termination to initiate its harvest. The sheer, unfiltered radiation of ancient malice projecting from those human eyes triggered an explosive, catastrophic reaction within the deepest, most primitive sectors of my brain. The biological desire for peaceful cessation was instantly, violently incinerated. A massive, unprecedented surge of adrenaline and raw, panicked survival instinct forcefully overrode the hypothermic paralysis gripping my central nervous system. I desperately wanted to live. I possessed an absolute, burning necessity to escape the physical reach of the towering anomaly. My hands, numb and completely devoid of tactile sensation, frantically grappled with the discarded thermal layers. I forced my body into the heavy parka with chaotic, uncoordinated movements, entirely driven by the absolute terror of the bipedal entity observing my every action. I launched my physical mass away from the boulder, driving my boots into the deep snowpack, initiating a frantic, agonizing retreat back down the steep glacial incline. My physical coordination was severely compromised, resulting in numerous painful collisions with the rough bark of the birch trees. I constantly, obsessively, directed my optical focus over my shoulder, scanning the darkness for the towering silhouette. The entity had initiated a pursuit. It did not utilize a rapid quadrupedal sprint. It maintained its impossible bipedal architecture, navigating the complex geometry of the dense forest with a smooth, gliding locomotion that completely defied the standard physics of organic momentum. It maintained a precise, calculated spatial distance, tracking my frantic descent from a parallel trajectory within the trees. Whenever I managed to secure a brief visual confirmation of its form, it was standing perfectly still behind a massive trunk, its pale, asymmetrical skull peering around the bark, those flawless human eyes locked onto my retreating body. The physical journey back to the immobilized vehicle was a masterpiece of psychological torture. Every single microscopic visual displacement within the shadows amplified the terror flooding my veins. I finally breached the perimeter of the logging route, my body violently colliding with the frozen metal of the rental vehicle. I manipulated the heavy door handle, throwing my mass into the driver's seat and frantically engaging the ignition mechanism. The internal illumination of the dashboard flared to life, casting a weak, artificial glow against the surrounding snowbanks. I engaged the exterior headlamps, projecting twin beams of intense halogen light directly into the dense edge of the birch forest. Standing exactly at the absolute boundary of the optical illumination, perfectly framed between two ancient trunks, was the towering necrotic anomaly. It maintained its bipedal posture, its front appendages hanging uselessly against its torso. The intense light clearly illuminated the severe decay of its pale dermis and the heavy, dark stains coating its asymmetrical antlers. It did not breach the perimeter of the light. It simply stood there, an impossible monument of corrupted biology, its human eyes entirely absorbing the halogen beams, presenting a final, terrifying visual confirmation of its existence before I engaged the transmission and forcefully reversed the vehicle away from the frozen wilderness. I survived the Arctic night. The physical damage inflicted by the extreme temperatures eventually healed, but the psychological alteration is permanent. I journeyed into the deepest, darkest isolation of the world, specifically seeking the absolute embrace of death, only to encounter a physical manifestation of ancient, predatory darkness so profoundly horrifying that it violently forced me to choose life. The world contains entities that exist far beyond the boundaries of our scientific comprehension. Anomalies that wear the decaying masks of nature, patiently waiting in the extreme cold to harvest those who wander too deeply into the dark.